Does anyone else remember that one time in Virginia history when a mad scientist took a 17-year-old girl to the Supreme Court arguing that her genetic material was so inferior that she needed to be sterilized for the permanent good of society? And then, instead of getting laughed out of court, the Supreme Court agrees and says, quote, 3 generations of imbeciles is enough. And then, pre-World War II, Germans used that ruling to justify not just involuntary sterilizations, but involuntary euthanasia. What happened in these buildings isn't just important for Virginia history or American history, it influenced world history. Oh, who am I? I'm just Johnny Ashley, your neighborhood backwoods history and travel channel. You can find me on Facebook as The Real Hood in the Woods, and on Instagram as Abandoned in Appalachia. If you'd like to help me out, and help yourself out too, you should get the official copy of the Hood in the Woods books, volume 1 through 3. So my first book didn't always have to be trash. I rewrote volume 1. I wrote a lot more stories for it, and the word count is now doubled. I'm going to have a link for these books in the description. Another thing in the description is going to be a link to my other YouTube channel, The Family Court Guy. In 1770, the Hospital for Insane and Disorderly Minds opened in Williamsburg, Virginia. It was the first public mental health institution in America. Williamsburg was central for coastal Virginia, so they began looking for a place that was central for the rest of the state. They picked Stanton, as it sat on a major crossroads. The town decided that they were going to become leaders in educating women and the handicapped. In 1838, they opened an abnormal school for deaf and blind children. That school is still open. Soon the Western Hospital opened in Stanton. The original buildings were designed by Thomas Blackburn, and he was a protege of Thomas Jefferson. He worked closely with the hospital's superintendent, Dr. Francis Stribling, to design a tranquil environment. Dr. Stribling believed in the moral therapy approach to cure for mental illness. It requires a comfortable, tranquil environment. Terrace gardens were built for patients to get fresh air and exercise. The hospital opened in 1828. The patients' rooms were built luxuriously and resembled a resort. There was also many ridiculous reasons why people could be placed here. Husbands would leave their wives here. Unwanted children and those with learning disabilities would end up here. As asylums began becoming warehouses for the misfits of society, the population swelled. This is before Social Security, and the hospital operated on a budget set by politicians. As the population of the hospital grew, the budget did not. Doctors at the asylum, using the medical knowledge of the era, couldn't tell the difference between someone with a learning disability, a mental illness, or some explained or unknown medical issue. People with epilepsy were brought here. At that time, there was no medical explanation of why they would have random seizures. Multiple sclerosis is a disease that destroys the insulating covers on nerve cells in the brain and spinal cord. The damage to the nerve cells can cause double vision or blindness. Muscle mass also gets lost. Dr. Stribling's moral health approach was very kind-hearted. And while this place would have made a great spa for someone who was stressed out, it didn't cure schizophrenia or epilepsy. Dr. Stribling would remain in charge of the hospital until his death in 1874. Treatments and tortures. After the Civil War, the original superintendents of state hospitals began to age out, and combined with new technology, the moral therapy approach was replaced with some of the more brutal treatments we associate with asylums. In 1935, Dr. Freeman read about a technique being tested on animals. By removing small parts of the frontal lobe of a chimpanzee, doctors were able to correct its bad behavior. Dr. Freeman modified the procedure and renamed it lobotomy. He performed the first lobotomy in America on a 63-year-old woman who suffered from insomnia and depression. He drilled 6 holes in her head. After the surgery, she was cured, and she lived another 5 years. Dr. Freeman performed more lobotomies and came up with a less invasive method. Instead of drilling through the skull, he would use electroshock to knock out the patient, then use an ice pick and hammer to enter the skull through an eye socket. Instead of curing the patients, lobotomy would often leave them in a childlike state, or even worse, in a vegetative state. Ultimately, that is why it became popular. It made the patients easier to handle. Dr. Freeman toured the country, showing doctors how to perform the procedure. This is a ceramic head that was used to teach doctors lobotomy. Personally, Dr. Freeman performed 2,900 lobotomies. 19 of them were on patients under the age of 18. In the 1940s and 50s, 40,000 lobotomies were performed in America, and 490 patients died as a result. Dr. Freeman performed his last lobotomy in 1967. The patient died 3 days later. That was also the last year that lobotomies were performed in America. Besides lobotomy, ECT, or electroconversion therapy, was also done here. A Portuguese doctor noticed that patients with both mental health issues and epilepsy would have improvements after a seizure. In 1934, a drug called metrazole was discovered. When given in high enough doses, it would induce seizures. Again, patients' condition seemed to improve afterwards. In 1937, the first international conference on pharmaceutical conversion therapy was held. They discussed problems with the method, notably that during the seizures, the patients would thrash so violently that they would break their own vertebrae. Scientists began looking for other ways to induce seizures. Around that same time, an Italian doctor was at a butcher shop when he watched the butcher give the pigs an electric shock before slaughtering them. The shock would leave them in a coma-like state. Dr. Satelli told his colleague Dr. Bini about this, and in 1938 they developed the first electroconversion therapy machine. The first human patient was diagnosed with schizophrenia, delusions, hallucinations, and confusion. The treatment worked, and the patient improved. ECT quickly gained popularity, and by the 1940s it was used in almost every psychiatric hospital in the world. Dr. Satelli and Dr. Bini were nominated for a Nobel Peace Prize. ECT is recognized as the first medical breakthrough in mental health treatment and is still used today. A study in 2012 said 1 million people worldwide receive ECT treatments. Personally, I know someone who receives it, and they say it works better than any medication. All that said, when it was done here, it was still a developing treatment, and the patients here were the guinea pigs. Too much electricity could still induce violent seizures, causing broken bones and other injuries to the patients. They would be held down or tied to a table or bed. If you could make it through the treatment, there would be days of after effects. People would suffer from prolonged headaches and severe memory loss. Unlike my friend's mom, who just willingly drives to the doctor to get her treatment, the patients here would be pulled off the wards kicking and screaming. While ECT is still used, insulin shock therapy is not. In 1927, Dr. Sekel was working in Berlin. He was giving psychopaths and drug addicts low doses of insulin. One patient accidentally slipped into a coma and woke up with increased mental clarity. Soon he was giving schizophrenic patients larger doses of insulin in order to deliberately induce comas and sometimes convulsions. In 1933, he went public with his findings. By the 1940s, most mental hospitals in America were using it. It was popular throughout the 40s, and the use declined in the latter half of the 50s. Studies showed that the insulin patients didn't have any better results than the control group. It was completely phased out by the 1980s. A new treatment for mental health also began here at Western State, and just like the other treatments, soon it would be practiced worldwide. Virginia's involuntary sterilization policy. This is Dr. Joseph D. Jornet. His dad was an officer in the Southern Army, and his uncle served in both the U.S. and the Southern House of Representatives. He went to the Medical College of Virginia, graduating in 1884. In 1904, he became the first president of the Augusta Medical Society. He worked at Western Hospital and married another doctor who worked there. He was wealthy, affluent, and well-connected. In 1905, he was promoted to superintendent. After becoming the superintendent of Western, he revamped the hospital's therapeutic standards, unlocked the patient's doors, and instituted more sympathetic treatments. Dr. D. Jornet was a devout Presbyterian and supported the temperance movement. He also supported the Eugenics movement. He believed that the undesirable human traits were hereditary. The cure for insanity, criminality, and feeble-mindedness was to sterilize people so they couldn't reproduce and create more undesirables. In his 1908 report, he recommended that the state prohibit marriage between the insane, alcoholics, epileptics, people with syphilis, people with tuberculosis, and the feeble-minded. He argued that they should be sterilized, because it amounted to a crime to burden society by allowing them to procreate. This is Harry Laughlin. He was the head of the Eugenics Record Office from its opening in 1910 until its closure in 1939. He bred champion racehorses, and that selective breeding became the basis for his theories. The funding for the Eugenics Record Office came from the Darwin family, the Carnegie Institute, the widow of a wealthy railroad tycoon, but most of it came from the Rockefeller Foundation. By 1914, 12 states had passed sterilization laws, Indiana being the first in 1907. Laughlin's problem was that California was the only state regularly sterilizing people. He decided the laws weren't clear enough, so in 1922 he published his study, American Sterilization Policy, Eugenical Sterilizations in the United States. Listed as qualified for sterilization were the feeble-minded, the insane, criminals, epileptics, alcoholics, blind people, people with deformities, and the indigent. With a better law available, 18 more states passed eugenics laws based on Laughlin's model. Imagine a law being passed written by a corporation or lobbyist. That's pretty much the laws these states passed. Laughlin gave testimony in support of the Immigration Act of 1924. He said that immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe suffered from excessive amounts of insanity. This is Albert Priddy. He was the superintendent of the asylum in Marion, Virginia. That asylum is now a prison for the criminally insane. This is Aubrey Strode. He sat on the state legislature. His claim to fame was the Racial Integrity Act, which prohibited interracial marriage. He is the one who came up with the one-drop rule. Together with Dr. D. Jornet, they wrote a bill to authorize the opening of the colony for epileptics and the feeble-minded. They wanted to separate those with learning disabilities and unknown conditions from the violent or criminal populations of the asylums and prisons they were in. This was for their own protection. Another goal was to isolate those with learning disabilities and other qualities deemed unfit from society so they couldn't reproduce. The land for the colony was bought with proceeds of the sale of land deeded to Western Hospital. It is built on a hill across from the James River from Lynchburg. The facility was originally built for 100 people. The first patients came here in 1911, and by the end of the year, 150 men lived here. They were brought from state asylums and prisons. Priddy was the superintendent of the colony. Originally, it was planned to be only males, but after a year he allowed females here, and by 1913 a building to house 100 women was built. In 1919, the average population of the colony was 508 patients. 357 were classified as epileptic, and 151 classified as feeble-minded. By 1926, the population of the colony was 845 patients, 347 males and 164 females classified as epileptic, and another 334 females classified as feeble-minded. In the 1920s, D. Jornet and his buddy Strode began lobbying the Virginia General Assembly to pass sterilization laws. D. Jornet spent 16 years lobbying for eugenics. He spoke to medical societies, social workers, and university students. Albert Trinkle was the 49th governor of Virginia. He was also a longtime political ally of Strode's and a strong supporter of eugenics. Trinkle released a report critical of Virginia's financial situation. The state was spending too much money housing defectives and undesirables in institutions. They needed to be sterilized and released. That way they, nor their next generation, would be a financial burden to the state. Trinkle signed the Virginia Eugenics Act on March 20th, 1924. Now they had their law written, they needed someone to test it out on. Buck v. Bell. Carrie Buck was born in 1906 in Charlottesville, Virginia. Her father abandoned the family when she was 3, and her mother, Emma, was institutionalized for being feeble-minded and promiscuous. Carrie grew up with foster parents, John and Alice Dobbs. At 17, she got pregnant and accused the Dobbs nephew of taking unwanted advances. The Dobbs petitioned the court to have her institutionalized, and she received a similar diagnosis as her mom. Her mom was already at the colony, and Priddy, the superintendent, made sure Carrie was sent there too. This is a picture of Carrie and her mom at the colony. Carrie and her mom being at the same institution with the same diagnosis made her the perfect candidate to test the legality of the new law, and she was the first person selected to be involuntarily sterilized. Her lawyers challenged the constitutionality of the law. Several healthcare workers testified that Carrie was feeble-minded and that her daughter was below average. In 1925, the Virginia Circuit Court found the law constitutional and that Carrie was a suitable candidate for sterilization, calling her a, quote, potential parent of a socially inadequate offspring. The case made its way up to the Supreme Court, but Dr. Pretty died before the Supreme Court hearing, and he was replaced by Dr. Bell, who's the guy in this picture. That's why the case is called Buck v. Bell and not Buck v. Pretty. This is Carrie Buck's pedigree chart, drawn by Harry Laughlin. It is done to the standard that Eugenics Record Office format used to demonstrate the heredity passage of undesirable traits. DeJournette testified about the heredity of feeble-mindedness, and so did Laughlin. Laughlin had never met Buck, or her family, but he called them the most shiftless, ignorant, worthless class of whites in the South. Buck's pregnancy ended with the birth of her daughter Vivian, who was placed in custody of the Dobbs. This picture was taken a day before the Buck v. Bell trial. It is Alice Dobbs, the foster mom, holding Vivian while flashing a coin past the baby's face in a test to assess her intelligence. The infant, perhaps distracted by the camera, didn't follow the coin with her eyes and was thus declared an imbecile. In 1927, the U.S. Supreme Court upheld the decision 8-1. In the ruling, Justice Oliver Holmes Jr. wrote, 3 generations of imbeciles are enough. Vivian grew up with the Dobbs, but died at the age of 8. The year before, she made the school's honor roll. 5 months after the hearing, Carrie was sterilized, here, in the Hansley-Jennings building. Buck was far from the first sterilization at the colony. Dr. Pretty performed 80 there between 1916 and 1917. Buck had a younger sister called Doris. She was sterilized as a teenager when she went to have her appendix removed. The procedure was performed without her knowledge or consent. Carrie left the colony in 1929. In 1932, she got married. This is a picture of her on her wedding day. She remained married until her husband's death, and then she was remarried again. She remained married until she died in 1983. This is one of the last pictures taken of Carrie Buck. It was taken by Paul Lombardo, who was a professor at law at Georgia State. This is the grave of Carrie Buck. He spent 25 years researching Buck v. Bell. Eventually, he was able to track down Carrie Buck, and he interviewed her before her death. After interviewing Carrie and studying the case, the professor alleged that several people had fabricated evidence and that Carrie was of normal intelligence. Professor Lombardo was one of the few people to attend Carrie's funeral. This form was used by state hospitals to order sterilizations. It says, upon consideration of the evidence introduced at the hearing of this matter, the board finds that said inmate is insane, idiotic, imbecile, feeble-minded, and epileptic, and by the laws of heredity, is a probable potential parent of socially inadequate offspring, likewise afflicted. That the said inmate may be sexually sterilized without determination to their general health, and that the welfare of the inmate and of society will be promoted by such sterilization. After the form was filed, they had 30 days to complete the sterilization. 3 years after Buck v. Bell, DeJournette had sterilized 33 women and 60 men. In a 1931 issue of Virginia Medical Monthly, he said, quote, "We are just getting a good trim and expect to sterilize 500 people a year in the 5 state hospitals." By then, 18 states had passed sterilization laws based on Laughlin's model. In 1932, he founded the DeJournette Sanitarium. It was built right next to the old state hospital. It was a private hospital for middle-class patients, and it operated separately from the government-funded hospital. The next year, in 1933, and using Buck v. Bell as justification, the political party that controlled pre-World War II Germany also began passing eugenics laws based on Laughlin's model. American eugenicists also favored segregation. They had a lot in common with the Germans. The Immigration Act of 1924, which Laughlin had testified in favor of, was now being used to turn away European refugees fleeing the Germans. In 1936, Laughlin was awarded an honorary degree from the Heidelberg University. Soon, Germany was leading the world in performing forced sterilizations. California led America, Virginia was in second place, and DeJarnette was not pleased. He watched the Germans' progress carefully and spoke favorably of their programs. In 1934, he begged the Virginia General Assembly to broaden the scope of the eugenics program. "The Germans are beating us at our own game," he said. In 1938, DeJarnette said, "Germany in 6 years sterilized 80,000 of their unfit, while America, with twice the population, has only sterilized about 27,000 in 20 years. DeJarnette and the leader of that pre-World War II German political party were pen pals, and they would write each other, talking about creating the perfect race of humans. Gregory Mendel was a scientist who in the 1850s did experiments on pea plants. His findings established many of the laws of heredity used by modern science. DeJarnette wrote a poem called Mendel's Law, a plea for a better race of man. This is the law of Mendel, and often he make it plain. Defects will breed defects, and the insane will breed insane. Or why do we allow these people to breed back to the monkey's nest? To increase our country's burden, when we should only breed the best." Working hard to be known as a mad scientist, DeJarnette began experimenting trying to sterilize people with x-rays. He also began experimenting with blood transfusion. Mad Dr. DeJarnette began taking blood from a person with depression and giving it to a person with mania to see if it would calm them down. In 1943, the state removed him as the superintendent of Western Hospital, but he remained in charge of the DeJarnette Sanitarium until 1947. The Germans' involuntary sterilization program soon evolved into an involuntary euthanasia program and involved a series of camps around Europe. After World War II, when the actions of the Germans were exposed, the popularity of eugenics quickly declined in America. Even after losing both his hospitals, DeJarnette never stopped supporting eugenics or segregation. He died in 1957 and is buried next to his wife. They had no children. Skinner v. Oklahoma. In 1942, the U.S. Supreme Court heard Skinner v. Oklahoma. The court ruled that forced sterilizations of criminals was unconstitutional if similar laws were treated differently. The law in Oklahoma applied to habitual criminals, but that law excluded white-collar crimes. The law was passed in 1935, and Skinner was sterilized in 1936. He then sued the state. The law said to sterilize crimes of moral turpitude, but not to sterilize crimes without. Justice Douglas could not justify the distinction between larceny, which involved moral turpitude, and embezzlement that did not involve moral turpitude. Different results would be had if you robbed a bank with a gun or robbed a bank with a pen. A man who stole one chicken twice could be sterilized, but a cashier at a store could steal out of the till 1,000 times and still not be sterilized. It violated the 14th Amendment of equality under the law and was deemed to be cruel and unusual punishment. This ruling only applied to sterilizing convicted criminals, and it did not overturn Buck v. Bell. Since Carrie Buck hadn't been convicted of a crime, she wasn't being punished, and so she couldn't sue for cruel and unusual punishment. This ruling began the decline of eugenics in America, but it wasn't the end of it. The ruling only applied to punitive sterilizations, and out of the 64,000 sterilizations that happened in America, most of them were done at asylums and state schools. Under Bell's leadership, the colony doubled in size and expanded educational programs. In 1940, the population of the colony was 2,019 residents. During the 1950s, there was a swing towards educating and providing programs for patients in places like this. In 1952, the state approved funding for training at the colony for employees to better work with the patients. By 1955, 155 people had completed the 115-hour class. More programs were added for the patients, and by 1955, 2/3 of the patients were in classes taught by 28 teachers. A farm was built at the school, and it was used until the 1950s. They grew soybeans, corn, wheat, vegetables, and hay. There was also a herd of dairy cows, and they raised hogs. Using the residents to staff the farm was usually profitable. A barn burned down in 1921, and then in 1958, the dairy building was converted into dorms. By 1968, all that was left of the farm was the greenhouse. Modern medicine. The decline of asylums began with modern medicine and changes in the way that people with mental illnesses were treated. Lithium is a naturally occurring element. It's number 3 on the periodic table. It was first discovered in 1817 and dug from mines in Australia and Chile. In the late 1800s, Denmark began using it to treat mania, but no papers were published on it. In 1949, Dr. John Cade published the first paper on it. His dad had worked for the Department of Mental Hygiene, and he grew up on the hospital grounds. John followed his dad into the medical field. During World War II, he was captured in the Pacific by the Japanese, and he spent 3 years in a POW camp. While he was in prison there, he noticed the strange behavior of other POWs. He thought a toxin was affecting their brain, but when it was eliminated through their urine, they would lose their symptoms. After the war, he returned to working in mental hospitals. He began doing experiments with urine. It has 2 toxic substances, urea and uric acid. The urea levels were the same in healthy and ill patients, so he began working on the uric acid. He would need different strengths of uric acid, but it wasn't water soluble. He added lithium as a bonding agent, making it lithium urate. Dr. Cade began doing experiments with guinea pigs, and he noted that the ones giving lithium were much more rested than the ones in the control group. To make sure it wouldn't be fatal to humans, and that he had got the dosage right, he tried it, and he lived. He conducted human trials on patients with mania and depression, and he got good results. The calming effect was so strong that he thought these issues were caused by a lack of lithium. A few people died of lithium toxicity, but soon tests were made to check the lithium levels in the blood. Dr. Cade published his findings, but lithium was slow to gain popularity. You see, the problem with lithium was that it was a natural element and it couldn't get trademarked. So therefore, a bunch of corporations couldn't make a bunch of money off of it. In the 1960s, US psychologists began prescribing it without FDA approval. Doctors began lobbying themselves, and they set up clinics to perform their own studies. 22 years after Dr. Cade discovered the healing properties of lithium, the FDA approved it for use in 1970. Gerardo Rivera and Willowbrook State School. On Staten Island, New York City, Willowbrook State School housed 5,000 children and adults with learning disabilities. In 1965, Senator Robert Kennedy toured the school. He called it overcrowded, with people living in filth and dirt, their clothes in rags, the rooms as comfortable and cheery as the cages we keep animals in at the zoo. He pleaded for a change. Donna Stone was an advocate for the treatment of the mentally ill and learning disabled. She posed as a social worker and applied for a job at Willowbrook, and she got it. She spent several days working in the back ward and realized conditions were worse than she imagined. She went to the press with her information, and multiple stories were published. A doctor at Willowbrook named Michael Wilkins urged parents of children there to organize and protest to demand better conditions. The first reporter to publish a story about the school was Jane Kirtland. While covering the protest, she met 2 social workers who worked there, and they let her inside. There, she witnessed the horrible conditions firsthand. As no good deed goes unpunished, after the stories were published, Dr. Wilkins was fired. Dr. Wilkins returned the favor by contacting Gerardo Rivera, a local investigative reporter, and then sneaking him and his TV crew into the back door. What Gerardo saw was shocking. These are kids laying underneath sinks. Here's a cafeteria of children that are unable to feed themselves. Budget cuts had reduced the staff to the point that they only had 3 minutes per child to feed them. While school was in the name, it's very misleading, and there was the bare minimum of educational programs available. Most of the children sat unstimulated and unattended on the wards all day long. While the funding for Willowbrook had decreased, the population had increased. The adult wards weren't much better. Disease was rampant. Most of the residents contracted hepatitis B from the water supply within 6 months of getting there. Gerardo set up a tour with another state school called Letchworth Village, but just to keep him honest, he showed up 2 hours early. That's him right there, hopping over something as he's sneaking up on them through the woods. He caught him cleaning and bringing in fresh clothes and beds for the kids. Fresh laundry and a little bit of mopping couldn't cover up the real problems, though. 25% of the funding for Letchworth Village came from the federal government. One of the conditions to receive this money was that every patient got 85 square feet of space. At Letchworth Village, they received 35 feet of square space. Staff says because of funding cuts, some days there's only 4 staff members to take care of 100 children. Then staff showed them this empty ward. It couldn't be opened because they did not have the 37 staff members to operate it. This empty ward is also how they qualified for saying they had 85 square feet of space for the children when they only had 35 square feet. Using Geraldo's shocking footage, the nightly news ran a 10-part series. It's called Willowbrook, Our Last Disgrace. The series received national attention, and Geraldo won a Peabody Award. Using his footage as evidence, parents of children in Willowbrook filed a $500 million class action lawsuit in federal court. That case is called New York ARC vs. Rockefeller. In 1975, a judgment was signed by the courts and ordered the state of New York to improve the conditions at Willowbrook. It focused on reducing overpopulation and adding appropriate programming for children who otherwise sat unattended and unstimulated all day. 28 states were sued over the treatment of people in the state institutions, and those rulings began to shape the federal law. Everything from patients being individually funded with Medicaid to a new emphasis on community housing and not the larger institutions. The rules stating what would qualify someone for commitment changed, and a new emphasis was put on short-term care. Also, schools began having special ed programs. In 1980, Congress passed the Civil Rights of the Institutional Persons Act. It covered all institutions of state placement, from mental facilities to public nursing homes to jails and prisons. It didn't provide any new rights, but reinforced the ones given in the Constitution. 10 years after his original report, Geraldo Rivera, who is now a correspondent on 2020, went back to Willowbrook. He brought with him Bernard, a former patient who was misdiagnosed with a learning disorder when he really had cerebral palsy. Bernard had been at Willowbrook for 18 years, but by 1982 he was on the Consumer Advisory Board, helping monitor changes to the institution. There was no need to sneak in the back door because Bernard had his own set of keys. But to keep everyone honest, they either showed up a day early or a day late to catch the staff off guard. They caught construction crews repairing and pressure washing the building. Another school didn't do much better. He caught them bringing back the kids that they had hidden. Both schools were doing way better though, and Willowbrook only had 1,300 patients compared to the 5,000 that they had had 10 years before. Meanwhile, back in Virginia, the population of Western kept growing. In 1950, a second site opened on the campus. At peak, 3,000 people lived at both. As newer buildings were built in the 1960s, the old buildings began emptying out. By the 1970s, the old site was empty. In 1972, the General Assembly recommended that DeJournette Sanitarium be used to serve kids with severe behavioral disorders. In 1975, the state took control of the whole campus. DeJournette Sanitarium was only used for children. Everyone there over 21 was moved to Western. Everyone under 21 was removed from Western. A few renovations were made after it became only children, and in 1996 the DeJournette Sanitarium closed permanently, and the children were moved to a new wing at Western. The state began renovating the old campus at Western, and they turned it into a prison. The Southwest Virginia Asylum was also turned into a prison for the criminally insane. A prison operated here until 2002. After it was shut down, the property was sold to a developer. The first of the renovated condos was sold in 2008. The colony becomes a training center. By 1956, the population of the colony was 2,347. In 1957, it was growing by 5 people a week. 62 beds were added in 1962, and 248 beds were added in 1963. Admissions went from 6 a week in 1964 to 7 a week in 1965. They stopped taking new admissions in 1972, when the population was 3,686 patients. By 1979, the state had opened 3 other facilities, reducing the population of the colony by 1,500 people. The age of the patients ranged from 3 to 83, and they had a large range of physical and learning disabilities. The patients who were high-functioning began to get put in community placement, and the colony focused on the most severe patients. The Department of Justice opened an investigation into the colony, now called the Training Center, and in 2011 they published their report. 400 people lived here, and 1,100 people lived in the 5 facilities throughout the state. The Department of Justice reviewed policies, looked at patient records, and visited the institutions. They found multiple violations, including the state not developing quality community-based alternatives to institution, the state's failure to use existing community-based programs. They also found a flawed discharge program keeping people institutionalized. They also found that the community-based programs were putting the 3,000 people on the waiting list in danger. The state also needed to set up services for crisis situations to keep those people from being institutionalized. Institutionalizing people was found to be a violation of the Americans with Disability Act because they were taking away their freedom for having medical issues. Court rulings said, confinement in an institution severely diminishes the everyday life activities of individuals, including family relations, social contacts, work options, economic independence, educational advancement, and cultural enrichment. The Department of Justice expanded their investigation to the 4 other training centers in the state. The Department of Justice was also concerned about the use of restraints. Restraints can be used legally, but only in emergency situations. Here, they were being used as a first response, not a last resort. The report said, quote, "We also found evidence that several individuals resisted efforts of staff to get them to use what the training center termed, quote, voluntary restraints, raising the question about whether these restraints were voluntary at all." The DOJ met with former residents of the training center who now lived in community-based programs. Patient AA proudly showed the DOJ the bowling shoes and ball that he owned. He also had a membership at the local YMCA, went to the rec center, and visited friends in a nursing home. Patient CC went to church multiple times a week. Patient DD was a volunteer at a local fire department. Patients kept at the training center when they could be in community placement were being instilled with learned helplessness. They couldn't choose when or what to eat. Staff determined what programs were on TV. Patients' lives were filled with regimented daily activities, with little opportunity for choices, with little opportunity to interact with their non-disabled peers. Virginia acknowledged most of the people at the training center could be placed in community-based programs. Instead of trying to fight the case, the state began negotiations, and a year later a settlement was reached. Part of the settlement included closing the training center in 2020. 4 of the 5 other training centers in the state were also set to close. Patients began being sent other places, with the most severe cases staying at the training center. Then, in a 14-month period between 2015 and 2016, 6 patients died of UTIs. Those 6 patients represented 2% of the population. As the time for closing neared, the only patients left were bedridden and couldn't care for themselves. Families felt bullied to place their loved ones into group homes with what they felt was substandard care. In 2017, the training center was involved in another historic Supreme Court case. It was the first time that one state agency sued another agency in the same state. The case was only to determine if the Office of Protection and Advocacy could sue the Department of Behavioral Health and Development. The case stemmed from the training center refusing to give the Office of Protection and Advocacy records of 2 patients who had died there in 2006. The state had done a good job of emptying the large institutions, but had not done a good job of creating quality places to put the people. In 2020, the last patients left the training center and it closed. At capacity, 1,600 people worked there, and it was the largest employer in the county. With the amount of security guards the state's hired to keep people out of the training center, it probably still is the biggest employer in the county. The cemetery at the colony is 6 acres. The first recorded burial there was of a 16-year-old boy 1 month after the facility opened. Over 1,000 people are buried here. Most of them died at the colony, but a few of the graves are of people who died at other institutions. One simply reads unknown.
The last sterilization that happened at the colony was in 1956. By 1956, 24 states had involuntary sterilization laws. Combined, in 50 years, these states had sterilized 59,000 people. Between 1924 and 1979, Virginia sterilized 7,000 people. In 1974, the Virginia Eugenics Act was repealed. In the 50 years it had been in place, 7,000 people had been sterilized. In 1979, a class action lawsuit was filed by the ACLU for people who had been sterilized by the state of Virginia. Besides suing the state, individual doctors were named, as well as public and private hospitals and state schools. That lawsuit effectively ended all involuntary sterilization programs. In that lawsuit, it was alleged that patients had been sterilized without their knowledge. Now laws have been passed that say no sterilization can happen without signed consent. On the 75th anniversary of Buck v. Bell, Governor Warner issued an apology for Virginia's participation in the eugenics movement. Although bills to compensate the victims of eugenics had been in the works for 10 years, in 2012, delegates Marshall and Patrick were able to gain traction. The bill wasn't even voted on because the House of Delegates just added it to the budget. If you were a victim of Virginia's forced eugenics policy, I'll have a link in the description box to this video for you to get compensation.
Alright, that's my video. Hope you liked it. If you did like it, you need to hit the like button, hit the subscribe button. Don't be watching my stuff for free. Here, there's a couple more videos you might like.